I purchased my home in Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago after 15 years of government service. The neighborhood seemed perfect, mature oak trees lining quiet streets, well-maintained properties, and a sense of community that reminded me of where I grew up. The house itself was exactly what I wanted, a charming colonial with enough space for my needs, but what truly sold me was the detached guest house in the back. Separated from the main residence by a lovely garden and tall privacy fence, it offered the perfect balance of proximity and seclusion. My career as a security consultant for various government agencies required discretion. I never discussed specifics with neighbors, simply explaining that I worked with data analysis for federal programs. This vague description satisfied most people, and I preferred to keep conversation focused on gardening or local events rather than my professional life. The guest house was particularly valuable for my work arrangements, as it allowed occasional visitors to stay on the property while maintaining appropriate separation from my personal living space. Maintaining the guest house to exacting standards was necessary for my purposes. I installed separate utilities, enhanced security features, and ensured it had redundant systems for power and communication. To casual observers, these might have seemed like expensive upgrades for a simple guest cottage, but they were essential given how the space was occasionally utilized. Not that I advertised this fact to my neighbors. Discretion had become second nature after years in my field. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had a reputation for being reasonably fair. Most residents viewed it as a necessary evil to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. The monthly meetings were sparsely attended, decisions were made with minimal drama, and the annual dues seemed appropriately allocated to community improvements. I attended meetings when my schedule allowed, contributed to discussions when relevant, and otherwise kept a low profile. My first encounter with Barbara Thompson occurred at the annual summer barbecue in the community park. Most people called her Barb, but I would later learn that certain neighbors had taken to calling her Karen behind her back. She approached me with a friendly smile that did not quite reach her eyes, extending her hand in greeting while her gaze drifted past me toward my property. "You must be the owner of the colonial on Willow Lane," she said, her voice pleasant but evaluating. "I have noticed your beautiful landscaping. That guest house is quite unique for our neighborhood. Not many properties have separate structures." I thanked her for the compliment while noticing how her questions gradually became more pointed. How often did I have guests? What renovations had I completed? Had I filed all the proper permits? Was I aware of the HOA regulations regarding separate dwellings? Each question delivered with a smile but carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. I answered politely but vaguely, my professional training helping me redirect the conversation towards safer topics. As I walked home that evening, I reflected on the interaction. Something about Barbara had triggered my professional instincts, the same instincts that had kept me safe during my years of government work. Her interest seemed excessive, her attention too focused on my guest house. I made a mental note to be cautious in future interactions, not yet realizing how significant this casual neighborhood meeting would become in the months ahead. The annual HOA board elections came and went with little fanfare, but the results would profoundly impact my peaceful existence. Barbara Thompson was elected board president with what she described as a mandate for stricter enforcement of community standards. Her first official newsletter emphasized her commitment to addressing unauthorized modifications and rule violations that had been overlooked by previous boards. I found the community mailbox flyer tucked between advertisements, but something about the wording made me uneasy. 3 weeks after the election, the first official complaint arrived in my mailbox. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead with Barbara's signature prominently displayed at the bottom, cited concerns about the exterior paint color of my guest house. According to the notice, the shade of white I had used did not match the approved color palette for accessory structures in Oak Ridge Estates. The letter requested that I repaint within 30 days or face a daily fine. I knew this was incorrect. Before purchasing any paint, I had meticulously reviewed the HOA guidelines and selected a color from the approved list. I still had the documentation, including the paint receipt showing the exact shade name that appeared on the HOA approval form. I composed a polite response, attached the supporting documentation, and delivered it to T. He HOA office the next day. The secretary seemed surprised when I presented such thorough evidence, but assured me the matter would be resolved. 4 days later, Barbara appeared at my front door unannounced. She wore a bright blue blazer and carried a clipboard, her posture rigid and authoritative. "Good afternoon. I wanted to follow up personally about the paint violation. I understand you submitted some paperwork, but I thought it would be more efficient to inspect the property directly." "I appreciate your diligence," I replied, maintaining a professional tone despite my irritation at the unexpected visit. "But as my documentation shows, the paint color is Seaside Pearl, which is specifically listed in Category 3 of approved exterior finishes for the community." Barbara barely acknowledged my response, her eyes already scanning beyond me toward the backyard. "While I am here, I should also inspect the guest house more thoroughly. We have regulations about accessory dwellings that may not have been properly enforced before my tenure." "I am familiar with those regulations as well," I answered, not moving from my position in the doorway. "My property is in full compliance, as documented in my original purchase agreement and subsequent renovation approvals." Her smile tightened. "Even so, as HOA president, I have the authority to inspect properties when violations are reported. Several neighbors have expressed concerns." This was clearly an escalation tactic. I would be happy to address any specific concerns through the proper channels. If there are additional complaints, please submit them in writing as required by HOA Bylaws Section 4.3. I will not be providing access to my guest house today. Barbara appeared momentarily stunned. Most residents apparently capitulated to her demands without question. Her face flushed with indignation as she realized I would not be easily intimidated. "This is highly irregular. The board has inspection rights clearly stated in our covenants." "With proper notice and legitimate cause," I added calmly, "neither of which applies today. Now if you will excuse me, I have work commitments this afternoon." As I closed the door, I glimpsed her expression through the sidelight window. The pleasant facade had vanished entirely, replaced by unmistakable anger. I watched as she stood motionless on my porch for several seconds before turning sharply and marching down the walkway. Through living room curtains, I noticed several neighbors quickly averting their gaze, having apparently been watching the confrontation unfold. That evening, I began a detailed log of all interactions with Barbara and the HOA board. My professional background had taught me the value of documentation, and something told me this conflict was far from over. I also installed additional security cameras covering the perimeter of my property, with particular attention to the areas surrounding the guest house. These precautions might have seemed excessive to an outside observer, but my instincts were signaling trouble ahead. The battle lines had been drawn. Barbara had clearly identified my guest house as her target, though she could not possibly understand its true significance. What had begun as neighborhood politics was evolving into something that could potentially compromise matters of actual national security. Over the next 2 months, my mailbox became a repository for HOA violation notices. Each week brought new complaints, each more trivial than the last. My hedges were allegedly 2 inches above regulation height. The positioning of my garden bench violated some obscure rule about lawn ornaments. The mailbox itself was apparently mounted 3 inches too low according to community standards. I addressed each complaint with meticulous documentation proving compliance, responding through certified mail to create a paper trail. My home office gradually transformed into what resembled a legal war room. One wall displayed a large calendar tracking every interaction, complaint, and response. File folders contained photographs documenting my property's compliance with each alleged violation. A separate binder held copies of all correspondence, organized chronologically. This systematic approach was second nature to me after years of government work, where documentation could mean the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failure. The neighborhood began to divide into factions. Some residents clearly aligned themselves with Barbara, watching my property and reporting back to her with any perceived infractions. Others quietly expressed support when we crossed paths, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach, but too intimidated to speak publicly against the board. Most neighbors simply kept their heads down, not wanting to attract Barbara's attention to their own properties. I discovered through a sympathetic neighbor that Barbara had been researching my background. She had been asking questions about my profession, my travel patterns, and specifically about visitors to my guest house. This crossed a line from annoying to concerning. While my cover as a data security consultant was technically true, it obscured the sensitive nature of my actual work with protected witnesses and intelligence assets. The guest house occasionally served as temporary housing for individuals who required absolute privacy and security, a fact known only to my superiors and immediate team. Barbara's surveillance became increasingly obvious. Her silver SUV would drive past my house multiple times daily, slowing noticeably by my driveway. On 3 occasions, I spotted her taking photographs of my property from the street. Once, I even caught her attempting to peer over my backyard fence, presumably to get a better view of the guest house. When confronted, she claimed to be admiring the landscaping in the neighborhood before hurriedly walking away. The situation took a more serious turn when I received notification from headquarters about an upcoming assignment. A key witness in a major corruption case would need secure housing for approximately 1 week while preparing for grand jury testimony. The guest house was deemed an ideal location, residential, inconspicuous, but with all necessary security infrastructure already in place. The message emphasized the high-profile nature of the case and the importance of maintaining absolute confidentiality. This development elevated Barbara's harassment from a personal nuisance to a potential security risk. I contacted my supervisor to discuss the situation, questioning whether we should relocate the witness given the circumstances. After reviewing the documentation of Barbara's behavior, my supervisor determined that the security measures already in place were sufficient to proceed with the original plan. We would, however, implement additional countermeasures and have a security team on standby. The witness would arrive in 3 days. I spent that time checking and rechecking every system in the guest house. The separate electrical panel was functioning properly. The secure communication lines were tested and confirmed operational. The discrete surveillance system covering all approaches to the property was recording properly. Standard protocols required these systems to operate independently with backup generators in case of power failure, and I verified that all redundancies were in working order. As I completed these preparations, I noticed Barbara's SUV parked down the street, her figure barely visible behind the steering wheel. She was watching my house with unusual persistence. The situation was evolving from harassment into what felt increasingly like reconnaissance. In my years of security work, I had learned to recognize the difference between casual curiosity and targeted surveillance. Barbara's behavior had decidedly crossed that line. That evening, I received an official letter from the HOA board demanding an emergency inspection of my guest house based on credible reports of unauthorized modifications that may impact adjacent properties. The timing could not have been more suspicious. The letter demanded access within 48 hours, exactly when the witness would be arriving. I immediately contacted my legal team, who prepared a formal response citing both HOA bylaw limitations and relevant privacy laws. This was no longer just about neighborhood politics. Barbara was unwittingly interfering with a matter of federal importance, and the stakes had risen dramatically. The witness arrived on Tuesday evening under cover of darkness. For security purposes, I will refer to him only as Michael. 2 plainclothes agents accompanied him in an unmarked sedan with government plates, performing a final perimeter check before escorting him quickly into the guest house. Michael would be testifying against former colleagues in a case involving corruption at the highest levels of a multinational corporation with significant government contracts. The grand jury appearance was scheduled for the following Monday, meaning he would be staying in my guest house for approximately 6 days. Security protocols were comprehensive but designed to avoid drawing attention. The agents departed after the initial security briefing, with plans for daily remote check-ins rather than physical visits that might attract notice. Michael was instructed not to leave the guest house unless absolutely necessary. The structure was stocked with provisions, secure communication equipment, and all materials needed to prepare for his testimony. I provided him with emergency contact procedures and reviewed the safety features of the residence, including the backup generator that would automatically engage if main power was interrupted. The weather matched the tension of the situation, with dark clouds gathering throughout the day and forecasts calling for severe thunderstorms. By evening, rain began falling steadily, occasionally illuminated by distant lightning. I maintained my normal routine to avoid arousing suspicion, working from my home office and preparing dinner at the usual time. Through my security monitors, I could see that Michael was safely settled in the guest house, reviewing documents related to his upcoming testimony. At approximately 8:43 p.m., during an intense downpour, the power to the guest house suddenly cut out. The main house remained illuminated, indicating this was not a neighborhood outage. Within seconds, the backup generator should have engaged, but the monitoring panel showed no activity. This simultaneous failure of both systems triggered immediate alarm. I activated the emergency security protocol on my phone while moving quickly toward the windows facing the backyard. Through the rain-streaked glass, illuminated by a flash of lightning, I saw a figure standing beside my electrical panel. The external utility box had been forcibly opened, and even through the storm I could clearly identify Barbara. She held what appeared to be bolt cutters, her posture conveying unmistakable satisfaction as she surveyed the now darkened guest house. This was not a casual act of vandalism, but a deliberate, targeted attack. My training took over as I simultaneously alerted the security team through encrypted channels while maintaining visual contact with Barbara. Protocol dictated that I should not engage directly, but instead secure the witness and await professional response. I moved quickly to the guest house through the connecting garden path, using the cover of darkness and rain to avoid being seen. Michael had already implemented security procedures as trained, moving away from windows and activating the emergency communication device. Someone has deliberately cut power to both main and backup systems, I explained quietly. Stay inside, away from windows. Response team is en route. Within 12 minutes, the first unmarked vehicle arrived, followed quickly by 2 more. 6 agents in plain clothes but with visible credentials emerged, moving with practiced efficiency despite the storm. 2 secured Michael inside, 3 established a perimeter, and the team leader approached Barbara, who remained near the electrical panel, apparently admiring her handiwork. From my position, I could see the moment Barbara realized she had stepped into something far beyond neighborhood politics. The agent displayed federal credentials, his expression grave as rain poured down around them. Barbara's face transformed through a series of emotions, first defiance, then confusion, and finally unmistakable fear as she comprehended that this was not a simple HOA matter. I was escorted to a secure vehicle for debriefing while the team assessed the damage and secured the scene. The senior agent, a colleague I had worked with previously, did not attempt to hide his concern. This is a serious breach of protocol. The witness is secure, but both primary and backup systems were compromised. The cuts to the wiring appear deliberate and targeted. She has been harassing me for months, I explained, providing a brief overview of Barbara's escalating behavior. I have documented everything. This seems to be a significant escalation from previous tactics. This goes well beyond harassment, he replied grimly. Tampering with federal security systems and potentially endangering a protected witness carries serious consequences. We will need your complete documentation and full statement. Barbara was being questioned separately, her previous confidence completely evaporated. Through the vehicle window, I could see her gesturing frantically, likely attempting to explain her actions as simple HOA enforcement. The agent's expressions revealed they were not accepting this explanation. After approximately 20 minutes, she was escorted to a separate vehicle, not under arrest but clearly not free to leave until the situation was fully assessed. By midnight, emergency repairs had restored power to the guest house, additional security personnel had been stationed on the property, and a complete investigation was underway. The witness remained secure, though the incident had necessitated changes to the protection plan. What had begun as neighborhood harassment had escalated into a federal security incident with potentially far-reaching implications. As I provided my formal statement to the investigators, I felt no satisfaction despite the turning of tables. Barbara had unwittingly inserted herself into matters far beyond her understanding, and the consequences would likely be severe. The storm continued through the night, a fitting backdrop to the chaos that had erupted in our previously peaceful neighborhood. By morning, every resident would know something significant had occurred, though few would understand the true nature or gravity of the situation. The community center meeting room had Neve. Been so silent. Around the large oak table sat the entire HOA board, expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. Across from them were three government officials in dark suits, their faces professionally neutral but radiating unmistakable authority. Barbara sat slightly apart from her fellow board members, her usually immaculate appearance now disheveled, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. I entered last, accompanied by the lead agent, and took a seat at the end of the table. No one had been officially charged yet. This meeting was classified as an informational briefing for all parties involved. The true purpose, however, was clear. Barbara and the HOA board needed to understand exactly what line had been crossed. The senior official began without preamble. "I am Special Agent Reynolds with the United States Marshals Service, Witness Security Division. My colleagues represent partner agencies with jurisdiction in this matter. We are here to address the events of Tuesday night and their implications." Barbara attempted to interject, but Agent Reynolds continued without acknowledging her. "The property in question, specifically the guest house owned by this individual," he gestured toward me, "occasionally serves as a government safe house for the Federal Witness Protection Program. It is one of several such facilities maintained in residential areas throughout the country, specifically because they blend seamlessly into normal neighborhoods." The blood drained from Barbara's face as Reynolds continued. "The individual staying there at the time of the incident is a federal witness in a case involving matters of national security. By deliberately cutting power to this facility, Ms. Thompson not only damaged government property, but potentially compromised a sensitive operation and endangered the life of a protected witness." The HOA vice president, a retired school principal named David, cleared his throat nervously. "There must be some misunderstanding. Our HOA has procedures for addressing code violations, but they certainly do not include tampering with utilities." "That is precisely why we are here," Reynolds replied. "What occurred was not an official HOA action, but appears to be the independent decision of your board president, potentially constituting several federal offenses." At this point, Barbara found her voice. "This is ridiculous. I was simply addressing violations of our community standards. That guest house has been a persistent problem, with unauthorized occupants coming and going. As HOA president, I have every right to inspect properties that violate our covenants." "Actually, you do not," interjected one of the other officials, opening a folder. "Your own bylaws, Section 4.3, explicitly state that property inspections require written notice, specific cause, and must be conducted during daylight hours with the homeowner present. Furthermore, no provision in your HOA agreement permits tampering with utilities under any circumstances." I retrieved my own documentation and placed it on the table. I have maintained records of all interactions with Ms. Thompson and the HOA board over the past several months. This includes 17 violation notices regarding my property, all of which were addressed with proof of compliance. I also have video evidence of Ms. Thompson conducting unauthorized surveillance of my property on multiple occasions. The officials reviewed the material with interest, while Barbara's fellow board members visibly distanced themselves from her, both physically and metaphorically. The HOA treasurer actually moved his chair several inches away from hers, a gesture not lost on anyone in the room. Agent Reynolds outlined the potential charges: tampering with government property, obstruction of justice, endangering a protected witness, and interference with federal duties. These are serious offenses with potential sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in federal prison, he explained, his tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "But I did not know," Barbara protested, her voice rising. "How could I possibly know this was a government facility? There were no markings, no notifications to the HOA." "That is precisely the point of a safe house, Ms. Thompson," Reynolds replied, "and lack of knowledge does not exempt one from responsibility when committing criminal acts. Even if this had been an ordinary guest house, cutting power to someone's property remains illegal." The other board members were now openly horrified, clearly calculating their own potential liability. David spoke up again. "I want to be absolutely clear that the board never authorized any action regarding utilities or trespassing on this property. If such actions were taken, they were done without board approval and outside our established procedures." Barbara appeared increasingly isolated as her colleagues distanced themselves from her actions. "HOA LL complained about that guest house too," she said accusingly. "Every one of you agreed it needed closer scrutiny." "Scrutiny does not mean criminal trespass and property damage," the HOA secretary responded firmly. "We all have concerns at times, but we have processes for a reason." As the meeting continued, it became clear that Barbara alone would bear the legal consequences of her actions, though the HOA might face civil liability for inadequate oversight. The board members voted on the spot to place her on immediate administrative leave pending further investigation. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had wielded such authority just days before now sat alone, abandoned by her supporters, facing consequences far beyond anything she had imagined possible when she cut those power lines. The legal machinery moved with methodical precision in the weeks following the incident. Federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined that criminal charges were warranted. Barbara was formally charged with tampering with government property, criminal trespass, and obstruction of justice. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement that would avoid prison time but include substantial fines, probation, and community service. The judge made it clear during sentencing that only her lack of prior criminal history and absence of knowledge regarding the safe house's specific purpose prevented a harsher outcome. Beyond the criminal proceedings, the HOA board called an emergency meeting open to all residents. The community center was filled beyond capacity, with neighbors standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. This was unprecedented attendance. Previous meetings had struggled to achieve quorum. News of federal agents in the neighborhood had spread rapidly, though most residents remained unaware of the full details. David, now acting as interim board president, opened the meeting with a prepared statement. "Recent events have revealed serious procedural failures in how our HOA operates. The board has unanimously voted to remove Barbara Thompson from her position as president, effective immediately. We are implementing new oversight measures to ensure all homeowner concerns are addressed through proper channels with appropriate documentation and transparency." What followed was a surprisingly candid discussion of how the HOA had gradually shifted from community management to what many residents described as petty tyranny. Neighbors who had remained silent for years now voiced their experiences of intimidation, selective enforcement, and arbitrary rule interpretations. The atmosphere felt like a community therapy session, with years of frustration finally finding outlet. During this meeting, I maintained a professional demeanor, neither condemning Barbara nor revealing additional details about the safe house operation. When directly addressed, I simply stated that all homeowners deserve fair treatment and due process, and that documentation is essential when dealing with any administrative body. My measured response earned respectful nods from neighbors who had previously viewed me with suspicion due to Barbara's campaign against my property. As news spread throughout the neighborhood, residents approached me privately to express support or apologize for believing rumors about my guest house. Some admitted they had reported minor issues to Barbara under pressure, fearing they would become her next target if they refused. The social dynamics of the community were rapidly reorganizing around new understandings of who could be trusted and who had abused power. Barbara herself became increasingly isolated. Her close allies on the board quickly distanced themselves, claiming they had been misled about her methods. Neighbors who had actively participated in her surveillance network now avoided eye contact when passing her house. The community's judgment manifested in small but significant ways. Invitations to social events stopped arriving, conversations ended when she approached, and her previously influential social media posts received no engagement. The HOA itself underwent substantial reform. The board established an oversight committee comprising residents from different sections of the neighborhood. All violation notices now required photographic evidence and citation of specific bylaw provisions. Homeowners gained the right to appeal decisions to this committee rather than just the board. Most significantly, inspection protocols were completely overhauled to require proper notice, specific cause, and homeowner consent. My role throughout this transition remained carefully balanced. While I had no interest in participating directly in HOA governance, I did provide guidance on documentation procedures and chain of custody for records based on my professional expertise. This contribution helped restore confidence in the system while maintaining appropriate distance from neighborhood. Politics. Barbara's legal consequences extended beyond criminal charges. My legal team filed a civil suit for harassment, property damage, and invasion of privacy. Rather than face further public proceedings, she agreed to a settlement that included financial compensation, a formal written apology, and a legally binding agreement to maintain distance from my property. The funds from this settlement were anonymously donated to a program supporting witnesses who must relocate after testimony. Throughout this period, my property continued to serve its dual purpose. The witness, Michael, had been relocated immediately following the incident, but after security upgrades and review, the guest house was recertified for program use. Additional safeguards were implemented, including enhanced physical security and more robust power backup systems. What Barbara had intended as an act of intimidation ultimately resulted in strengthened protection for future occupants. 6 months after the incident, Barbara listed her house for sale. The real estate listing emphasized privacy and minimal HOA restrictions as selling points, a final acknowledgement of how thoroughly her perspective had been altered by consequences. As her moving truck departed on a crisp autumn morning, several neighbors gathered spontaneously at the end of the street. No one spoke, but the collective sense of a chapter closing was palpable in the community that had been forever changed by her actions and their far-reaching aftermath. 1 year after the fateful night when federal agents descended on our quiet street, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed into the community it had always claimed to be. The reformed HOA operated with transparency that seemed almost radical compared to its previous incarnation. Monthly meetings were now well attended, with genuine discussion rather than dictated decisions. The quarterly newsletter highlighted community improvements and volunteer opportunities rather than violation statistics and threats of fines. My property remained under occasional scrutiny, not from hostile neighbors but from curious newcomers who had heard variations of what happened. The story had evolved in the telling. Some versions claimed Barbara had been arrested by FBI agents in the middle of the night. Others suggested the guest house contained classified military equipment. I neither confirmed nor denied these rumors, maintaining the same professional discretion that had guided my career. The guest house continued to serve its intended purpose, though with enhanced security features and more robust backup systems. Occasional government vehicles would arrive discreetly, their occupants quickly disappearing inside the structure without drawing attention. Neighbors now respectfully averted their gaze during these moments, a cultural shift that spoke volumes about how community priorities had changed. Barbara had relocated to a different state, according to those who maintained contact with her. Her house had sold quickly despite the circumstances, purchased by a young family who enthusiastically embraced neighborhood events. The property underwent significant renovations, as if the new owners were symbolically erasing all traces of its previous occupant. The transformation seemed to represent the broader healing taking place throughout the community. On a warm spring afternoon, I encountered David working in his front garden. Now serving as the elected HOA president, he had implemented the reforms promised during the crisis. "Remarkable how things have changed," he commented, leaning on his garden rake. "People actually volunteer for committees now. They trust the process." "Systems work when they are transparent and fair," I replied, "when rules exist to support community rather than control it." He nodded thoughtfully. "I still cannot believe how far things went. The federal charges everything. She never saw it coming." "Few people recognize when they have crossed important lines," I said. "Authority without accountability eventually leads to overreach." As we spoke, a car I recognized as belonging to the real estate agent who had sold Barbara's house drove slowly down the street. David lowered his voice. "I heard she is trying to sell her new place already. Apparently, the HOA there is unreasonable about her yard decorations." We shared a knowing look but avoided direct comment. Some lessons are never learned. That evening, as sunset painted the neighborhood in warm golden light, I walked the perimeter of my property, a habit from my security training that had become a peaceful ritual. The guest house stood quietly at the back of the garden, its purpose known to few, but its presence now accepted without question. In the distance, children played in yards where "for sale" signs had once sprouted during Barbara's reign. Neighbors chatted across fences that had previously served as boundaries. The experience had reinforced what my years of government service had taught me. Systems of authority require both respect and accountability. Standing firm against unreasonable power protects not just individual rights, but the principles of justice and security that affect us all. As twilight settled over Oak Ridge Estates, I reflected that sometimes the most important safe house is not a physical structure, but a community built on mutual respect and properly balanced authority.